It was a crisp Saturday afternoon, the type of day where the sun's golden rays filter through the large glass windows of a bustling shopping mall, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The air buzzed with excitement as families and friends wandered from one store to the next, indulging in the weekend's retail therapy. The mall, a massive structure of modern architecture, had become the social epicenter of the city. Shiny boutiques lined the hallways, while the scent of freshly brewed coffee and pretzels filled the air, mixing with the faint hum of conversation. Music from overhead speakers played softly, almost imperceptibly, blending with the ambient noise. In the midst of this lively scene, a figure moved with an aura of calm assurance. Melania Trump, tall and graceful, with a poised elegance that turned heads as she walked. Melania had always carried herself with a quiet strength. Today, her platinum blonde hair cascaded down in soft waves, and she wore a simple yet striking black coat that made her stand out even in a crowd. But despite her polished exterior, there was a visible restlessness about her. The slight furrow of her brow suggested that her mind was elsewhere, perhaps thinking of the latest initiative she was working on, or reflecting on the quieter moments of her life. It had been a while since she had ventured out on her own like this, away from the cameras and the glitz of high society, and she had welcomed the opportunity to blend in with the crowd. The peaceful anonymity of the mall offered her a rare chance to simply be, not as the first lady or a public figure, but as a woman who enjoyed the simplicity of a Saturday afternoon. As she passed by the array of store windows, she caught glimpses of families chatting, children running, and couples holding hands. There was a subtle beauty in the ordinary, in the moments that often went unnoticed. But amid this calm, there was an undercurrent of tension, like the quiet before a storm. Melania couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would pull her out of her comfortable world and into an unexpected situation. It was as though fate had something in store for her today, a gentle whisper from the universe telling her to be alert. She wandered into a children's store, one of those places filled with colorful toys and stuffed animals that seemed to embody the innocence and joy of childhood. Melania had always been drawn to spaces like this, where the laughter of children echoed through the aisles and the walls were adorned with vibrant images of fantasy. As she walked deeper into the store, her eyes scanned the shelves, noting the soft plush toys and the array of baby clothes. A faint smile played on her lips as she thought of the moments when she had been a mother to Barron, his wide eyes filled with wonder at the simplest things. It was then that she heard the sound, a faint, muffled sob. The sound was subtle, almost lost in the noise of the bustling mall, but to Melania, it stood out, piercing the serenity of the moment. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked around, her eyes sweeping over the store. There, at the far end of the aisle, a small figure stood alone, clutching a stuffed bear to their chest. The child, no more than 5 or 6, had a tear-streaked face, their tiny body trembling with distress. For a moment, Melania hesitated, unsure of what to do. She had always been someone who kept to herself, preferring the company of a select few, but there was something about this child that stirred something deep within her, a protective instinct that surfaced immediately. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, each step deliberate and measured. As she approached the child, her presence seemed to calm them. The child's eyes, wide and full of confusion, looked up at her with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Melania crouched down to their level, her eyes gentle and warm, her voice soft but firm as she spoke. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, her tone laced with kindness. "Are you lost?" The child nodded slowly, their little lip quivering. "I can't find my mommy," they whispered, their voice barely audible over the noise of the mall. Melania's heart ached. Without thinking, she extended her hand to the child. "Don't worry," she said softly. "I'll help you find her." There was no hesitation, no thought of anything other than getting this child back to safety. It was as if everything else in the world had faded away, and the only thing that mattered was the child in front of her. She took the child's hand in hers, the small fingers gripping her own with a desperate urgency. Together, they made their way out of the store, with Melania's mind racing as she tried to assess the situation. How had the child gotten separated from their parent? Was someone looking for them right now? The mall, though busy, was large and overwhelming, and it would be easy to get lost in the crowd. But there was a calm certainty in Melania's demeanor, a quiet confidence that radiated from her as she led the child through the maze of shops and crowds. The child, now slightly less fearful, looked up at her with wide eyes, still unsure of what was happening but reassured by the warmth of Melania's presence. "Thank you," the child whispered again, their voice barely audible. Melania smiled softly, squeezing their hand. "It's going to be okay," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "We'll find your mommy." As they moved deeper into the mall, Melania's mind continued to race. She had been in situations like this before, had seen the distress in people's eyes as they searched for loved ones or dealt with moments of crisis. But this felt different. There was something undeniably important about this moment, something that told her it was more than just a lost child. Little did she know that this seemingly simple act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change everything for her. As she continued to walk through the bustling mall, the tension that had been building beneath the surface was about to erupt. What Melania didn't know was that today, her life would take an unexpected turn, one that would test her in ways she could never have imagined. As Melania led the lost child through the bustling mall, her thoughts were racing, and her concern for the child's safety began to outweigh any lingering doubts. She continued to walk swiftly, scanning the crowd, her eyes sharp and focused. Her surroundings, once a mere backdrop to the afternoon's events, now seemed to close in around her, as if the mall itself was holding its breath. Each moment, each footstep, felt as though it might tip the balance between safety and disaster. The child clutched her hand tighter as they approached a busy central plaza in the mall, where a large fountain splashed in the middle of a tiled courtyard. It was here that the first hint of trouble made itself known. Melania's mind flickered with a sudden and sharp sense of unease. Something wasn't right. She could feel a pair of eyes watching them, a presence just beyond her peripheral vision. Her instincts told her to ignore it, to continue focusing on the child, but the sensation only grew stronger. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of a figure standing near one of the kiosks, a woman, no older than her mid-30s, with dark, shoulder-length hair and a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was watching Melania and the child intently, almost too intently. There was something unnerving about her gaze, a kind of calculating curiosity that made the hairs on the back of Melania's neck stand up. Before Melania could register much more, the woman disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind only a vague feeling of discomfort. It wasn't unusual for people to stare. After all, Melania's presence was undeniably attention-grabbing. But this felt different. This felt like more than just curiosity. She dismissed the thought, pushing it to the back of her mind, and refocused on the child, who was still clinging to her. "Let's go find your mommy," Melania said, her voice firm but gentle. The child nodded eagerly, but their small face remained clouded with anxiety. "Do you think she'll be mad at me for getting lost?" they asked softly. Melania's heart ached as she glanced down at the child, offering them a reassuring smile. "No, sweetheart," she said, squeezing their hand. "Your mommy is probably worried, but she'll be so relieved when she sees you again. You're not in trouble." Her words seemed to comfort the child, if only for a moment. They walked in silence for a few minutes, passing a few more stores and food courts, when a sudden loud voice broke through the soft murmur of the crowd. "Hey, wait a minute." Melania froze. The voice had come from behind her, sharp and demanding. She turned to see a man, middle-aged, tall, with dark, unkempt hair and a look of desperation in his eyes, striding toward them. His face was twisted in a mixture of frustration and fear, and his steps were quick, almost frantic. "That's my son," he shouted, pointing to the child who was still holding Melania's hand. The child recoiled slightly, instinctively trying to step closer to Melania. The man's presence felt threatening in that moment, and Melania's protective instincts kicked in immediately. She stepped between the man and the child, her stance becoming more defensive. "Who are you?" Melania asked, her voice calm but firm. Her eyes flicked to the child, who was now looking up at her with wide, fearful eyes. "I'm his father," the man barked, his tone rising with each word. "Give him back." The tension in the air was palpable. Melania's heart was racing, and she could feel a cold knot forming in her stomach. She glanced over her shoulder, trying to gauge the situation. The crowd around them seemed to be paying little attention, too absorbed in their own conversations, or their shopping to notice the confrontation taking place. She locked eyes with the man, her expression unwavering. "Are you sure?" she asked slowly, her tone just shy of accusatory. "What do you mean, am I sure?" "Of course I'm sure." The man's voice was rising now, and he took another step toward them, causing Melania to instinctively step back. "I'm his father. His mother's been looking all over for him. I'm here to take him back." Something didn't sit right with Melania. She glanced at the child, whose face was filled with confusion. The child's grip on her hand tightened, and she could feel the little body trembling. Melania's instinct screamed that something was wrong, but she couldn't place her finger on it. She turned to the child, crouching down to their level once again. "Sweetheart," she asked softly, "do you know this man?" The child looked up at the man, then back at Melania, their face scrunching in confusion. "No, I don't think so," they whispered. Melania's heart sank. Her protective instincts flared. The man's desperation only seemed to grow as he advanced another step. His eyes locked onto the child with an unsettling intensity. "Melania," a voice said suddenly, breaking through the tension. She turned, startled, to see a mall security guard approaching. The man's expression shifted as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Melania could almost feel the relief emanating from him. He straightened up, smoothing his clothes as he turned to face the security officer. "Is there a problem, sir?" the guard asked, his voice polite but professional. I'm just trying to find my son," the man stammered, his voice faltering slightly. The security guard raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll need to check the situation. Just stay right there, sir." The guard turned to Melania, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes searching her face for any sign of distress. "I think I'm fine," Melania replied, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "But I'm not sure if this man is really the child's father." The guard nodded, motioning for the man to step aside. "We'll need to verify that, sir. If you'll just come with me for a moment." Melania watched as the man's face flushed with anger, his eyes darting between her and the guard. For a moment, it seemed like he might protest, but then he lowered his gaze and gave a terse nod. "Fine," he muttered, before turning and walking off with the security guard. Melania exhaled slowly, her body relaxing for the first time since the encounter had started. The child, still trembling, looked up at her. "What happened?" they asked, their voice small and fragile. "I'm not sure," Melania said honestly, her mind racing, "but it's going to be okay now." However, even as she reassured the child, a lingering unease gnawed at her. The events felt too coincidental, the timing of the man's appearance just too perfect. Something was off. The crowd had seemed oblivious, but Melania couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching them the entire time, waiting for the right moment to intervene. As she continued walking, the unease that had started in the children's store now felt like a dark shadow trailing her, one that she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. She could only hope that the rest of the day would pass without incident, but deep down, she knew that this moment would not be the last of the strange happenings. Melania had no way of knowing just how close she was to a much bigger storm. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, like the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Melania led the child toward the security office, her mind racing with thoughts of the strange encounter. Every step she took felt slower, more deliberate, as though the world was closing in around her. She glanced back once more toward the fountain and the bustling mall, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that something was off. The security guard had been kind, but the unease from the man's aggressive behavior lingered like a dark cloud. She reached the security office, where a few officers were behind a desk, sorting through paperwork. The child, still quiet and frightened, clung to Melania's side, their small hand gripping her coat tightly. "I'm just going to talk to the officers for a moment," Melania said, offering the child a smile. "You're safe here. I'll be right back." The child nodded, their eyes wide with apprehension as they watched Melania walk toward the front desk. She caught the gaze of the officer who had initially spoken to her. His expression softened when he saw her approach. "Ms. Trump, we've confirmed that the man you spoke with earlier is, indeed, the child's father," the officer said, his voice calm and reassuring. He had just lost track of his son in the mall. "We've got him on camera, and everything checks out." Melania felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced with an unsettling feeling. Something in her gut told her that this resolution wasn't as simple as it seemed. She glanced back at the child, still standing quietly by the door. They were looking at her now, their eyes filled with uncertainty. "Are you sure?" she asked, trying to keep the doubt from creeping into her voice. There was something about the way he reacted that seemed off. The officer raised an eyebrow, noticing her hesitation. "I understand your concern, Ms. Trump, but we've done our checks. It seems like a simple case of a lost child. We've already called the mother, and she's on her way to pick him up." Melania wasn't convinced, but the officer's calm demeanor made her second-guess her instincts. Maybe she was just overthinking it. After all, it had been a stressful day, and she'd been thrust into a situation far outside her usual routine. "All right," she said softly, still not entirely satisfied. "If you're sure." She turned to walk back to the child, but just as she reached the door, a noise caught her attention. It was the sound of hurried footsteps, too quick and too deliberate. She turned, her heart racing, just in time to see the man burst through the security office door. His face was twisted with fury, his eyes wild as he spotted Melania and the child. "Get away from him!" he shouted, his voice a guttural growl. He lunged toward the child, his hands outstretched as though to grab them. Without thinking, Melania stepped in front of the child, blocking the man's path. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "No," she said, her voice firm, but her body was trembling with a sudden surge of adrenaline. "Stay back." The man froze, his eyes locking onto hers. There was something wild, almost manic, in his gaze. For a split second, it felt as though the entire room was holding its breath. The world seemed to freeze, the tension between them palpable. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the moment shattered. The man's gaze shifted toward the child, and his lips curled into a sneer. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. The security officers were already on their feet, rushing toward the man, but he was fast, too fast. With a guttural yell, he shoved one of the officers aside, his movements wild and erratic. The officer stumbled but quickly regained his footing, reaching for his radio. "Get back!" the man shouted again, now more desperate than angry. "This is none of your business." In that instant, Melania's mind was racing, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't just standing in the middle of a mall anymore. This was no longer a simple situation with a lost child. She was facing something darker, something she couldn't yet fully understand. She glanced around, looking for an escape, but the situation was spiraling too quickly. The man lunged forward again, this time grabbing the child by the wrist, yanking them toward him. The child cried out in terror, a sound that tore through Melania's chest like a knife. Without thinking, Melania acted on pure instinct. She lunged toward the man, grabbing his arm with both hands, pulling with all her strength to free the child. "Let go!" she shouted, her voice raw with fear and determination. The man struggled against her grip, his face twisted with rage. But Melania wasn't letting go. She wouldn't. Not while the child was in danger. The security officers were on them in seconds, pulling the man back and subduing him. One officer grabbed the man's arms, pinning them behind his back, while the other shielded Melania and the child. The scene was chaos, screaming, shouting, the sound of scuffling feet echoing throughout the small security room. But amidst it all, Melania stood frozen, her mind racing. Her heart still pounded in her chest, and she felt a cold sweat running down the back of her neck. The child was still crying, shaking in her arms, but their grip on her was firm, as though they were seeking solace in the one person who seemed to care. "Shoo," Melania murmured, her voice trembling but soothing. "It's all right. You're safe now." The officers quickly escorted the man out of the room, and Melania's mind slowly started to clear. Her body was still trembling from the intensity of the moment, but the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in. She had acted without thinking, without hesitation. But it wasn't until the man had been restrained that she realized the full extent of what she had just faced. The child, still in her arms, looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," they whispered, their voice small and fragile. Melania smiled softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from the child's forehead. "You're safe now," she whispered in return, though she couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning. The officers moved toward the door, their radios crackling as they spoke to one another. One of them, a tall woman with short brown hair, approached Melania with a look of concern. "We've got everything under control," she said, her voice steady but still tinged with urgency. "The man is in custody, but we're going to need a statement from you." Melania nodded, though her mind was still reeling. The whole event had happened so quickly, and yet, she knew deep down that something larger was at play. She glanced down at the child in her arms, feeling a deep sense of protectiveness surge within her. She had kept them safe, but for how long? And what had truly been the man's intent? As the officers moved to take the child back to their mother, Melania couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment, a moment that would shift the course of everything she knew. The storm had just begun. The aftermath of the incident was far from the quiet resolution Melania had hoped for. The moment the chaos had subsided, the adrenaline that had surged through her began to drain away, leaving a heavy weight in its place. As she stood in the security office, her hands trembling slightly, she tried to process what had just happened. The child had been handed over to their mother, whose tearful gratitude barely registered in Melania's mind. She could barely recall the woman's face as she reassured her child, who now clung to her mother with a sense of safety that Melania had once wished for herself in her own childhood. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? She had acted instinctively, stepping in when the child needed protection. And yet, in the quiet moments that followed, Melania couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The man, the wild desperation in his eyes, his sudden aggression, it didn't add up. He had seemed so sure of himself when claiming to be the father, yet his actions had spoken a different story. Why had he attacked the officers so violently? Why had he lashed out like that, if he was truly the child's guardian? Melania was still processing the whirlwind of events when she was escorted from the security office by one of the officers. The crowd outside had grown thicker, whispers circulating in the air like an invisible tide. People had witnessed the confrontation, some with smartphones raised, capturing the entire scene. It didn't take long for the incident to make headlines, and soon enough, news outlets were scrambling to cover the details. As Melania walked through the mall's parking garage, her thoughts remained clouded. She had only wanted a simple afternoon out, a quiet escape from the pressures of public life. But now, she felt exposed, vulnerable. The bright lights of the garage seemed to reflect the glare of the public eye, and she couldn't help but feel as though she were stepping back into a world she had been trying to momentarily forget. That evening, Melania's phone rang incessantly. Her team, her advisors, friends, even reporters. She let the calls go unanswered, her mind overwhelmed by the weight of what had transpired. She had gone from a quiet moment of helping a child to becoming the center of an international story. The fallout was immediate and intense. By the time she arrived back at her residence, the news was already plastered across every major outlet. Melania Trump saves lost child in mall. Shocking confrontation ensues. Headlines were filled with varying degrees of praise, but it was the undercurrent of doubt, the questioning of her actions, that troubled her most. "Is this just a PR stunt?" one headline asked, with a photo of Melania stepping in front of the child, her face a mixture of concern and resolve. Was this man really a father, or something else? Others speculated. Online forums were rife with conspiracies, suggesting that Melania's intervention had been planned, that she had somehow orchestrated the encounter for publicity. The questions gnawed at her, cutting deeper than she cared to admit. The social media reactions were equally unpredictable. Some praised her courage, calling her a hero. Others claimed she had been too quick to act, too trusting. Some even went so far as to say she was complicit in a staged kidnapping. The rumors spread like wildfire, with no clear answer in sight. Public perception, already a delicate balancing act for Melania, had shifted dramatically in a matter of hours. Internally, Melania struggled to reconcile her own emotions with the chaos around her. In her mind, She had done what any person would do. She had protected the child in a moment of danger. But as the reports piled up, as the questions swirled, she started to wonder if there was more to the situation than she had initially realized. Had the man truly been the father? Had he acted out of desperation? Or was there something darker at play? The officer's reassurances had been quick, but Melania's gut still told her there was something she hadn't seen, something hidden beneath the surface. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man's behavior had been more than just a misplaced reaction to fear. It had been calculated, like he had been expecting something, ready to spring into action the moment he was challenged. Despite the officer's confirmation, Melania knew there was no easy way to resolve the unease that lingered in her mind. She couldn't dismiss the event as just a strange coincidence, not when it had felt so deliberately orchestrated. The fact that the child had been so terrified that they hadn't recognized the man, none of it sat right with her. As the night wore on, Melania found herself pacing through her home, the echoes of the incident replaying in her mind. She replayed every moment, the man's aggressive actions, the child's frightened face, the officer's attempts to subdue him. She felt a deep sense of responsibility. Had she been too quick to trust? Had she put herself in danger, and by extension, the child as well? Or had she done the right thing, even if it wasn't clear-cut? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, and she opened it to find her team waiting for her. They looked at her with a mixture of concern and calm professionalism, ready to discuss the next steps. But Melania could feel the weight of their expectations, their need for answers, and the pressure to perform in a way that would soothe the public's anxieties. Melania, her chief advisor, began. "We've been getting calls all night. The public is reacting, and so are the tabloids. You've got people who are calling you a hero and others questioning your involvement in the whole thing." "I didn't ask for any of this," she replied sharply, though her voice lacked the usual conviction. The rawness of the situation had shaken her confidence. "I only wanted to help." Her advisor nodded, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "We know, but you're going to have to make a decision on how you want to move forward. People want answers. We've got to control the narrative before it spins out of hand." Melania looked out the window, her mind still reeling. She had never been one to court attention. She had always preferred privacy, quiet moments away from the spotlight. But now, the world was looking at her, waiting for her to speak, to make sense of the chaos. She had to choose. Would she embrace the role of the hero, despite the whispers of doubt? Or would she retreat into silence, hoping the story would eventually fade into the background? In the days that followed, the media frenzy continued to escalate. The authorities released a statement confirming that the man had indeed been the child's father, but the lingering questions remained. Melania's decision to speak or remain silent became the subject of much speculation. The personal toll of the event was undeniable. She found herself increasingly withdrawn, questioning the choices she had made and the consequences of her actions. The emotional weight of the incident took a toll on her, as well as the internal conflict between her sense of responsibility and the overwhelming pressure to maintain a carefully crafted public image. For now, the story had faded from the headlines, but Melania knew that the scars it left on her reputation, her sense of security, and her understanding of the world would remain long after the media circus had moved on. The days following the chaotic events in the mall seemed to blur together for Melania. The world had moved on quickly, as it always did, but she had not. She had been thrust into a spotlight she hadn't asked for, and though the media circus had slowly died down, the emotional toll of what had happened lingered in ways she hadn't expected. The moment the incident had ended, she thought it would be the end of the story, a moment of heroism that would pass. But like all things in her life, the consequences were far more complex and far more enduring than she had anticipated. The public response was polarized, as it often was when the Trump name was involved. On one hand, she was praised as a hero, a beacon of compassion and courage in the face of danger. On the other, she was scrutinized, her every action dissected, her motives questioned. People wanted to know, was this an act of selflessness or a carefully staged moment for publicity? Was she truly the savior of the child? Or had she been too quick to intervene, putting herself and others at risk? The media's fascination with her continued, but the public's opinion was shifting. In the weeks that followed, Melania found herself growing more distant from her former life. The demands of her public persona felt more suffocating than ever before, and the weight of the scrutiny pressed heavily on her. She longed for a simpler time, a time when she could move through the world unnoticed, when her actions didn't carry the weight of expectations. Internally, she wrestled with the consequences of that fateful day. The child was safe, and that was the ultimate goal. But what if the man's story had been true? What if, in her haste to protect the child, she had overstepped? The lingering doubt gnawed at her, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. Could she have done something differently? As the weeks passed, the legal ramifications for the man involved began to unfold. The police investigation revealed more about his background. He was indeed the child's father, but the circumstances of their separation were far from simple. A messy divorce had left him emotionally strained, and though his reaction in the mall had been extreme, it was not entirely without context. The man was struggling, and though his actions had been unacceptable, it became clear that he had been acting out of desperation rather than malice. The revelation brought some closure to the case, but it didn't do much to ease Melania's sense of uncertainty. She had acted in the moment, but how much of that had been instinct, and how much had been shaped by the pressure to be seen as the compassionate figure in the public eye? Could she ever truly know? In the midst of it all, Melania received a letter from the mother of the child she had protected. It was a simple note, handwritten and heartfelt, expressing her deep gratitude. The woman thanked Melania for her quick thinking and for ensuring that her child was safe. It was the kind of message that, in another life, Melania might have read and felt a sense of satisfaction. But now, it felt bittersweet, a reminder that the lines between what was real and what was constructed had blurred in ways she hadn't expected. Melania placed the letter on the mantelpiece, but she didn't know how to feel about it. The child was safe, yes, but at what cost? The emotional distance she had felt from the situation remained, a reminder of the complexity of human nature. She had stepped in because it was the right thing to do, but the weight of that decision had lingered in ways that were not immediately visible to anyone else. Her relationship with those closest to her, particularly her husband, had been strained in the aftermath. Though she had acted in the heat of the moment, the pressure of public opinion and the ripple effects of the event left her feeling disconnected. She had always maintained a certain distance from the complexities of public life, but now, more than ever, she felt like an outsider in her own world. In private conversations, Donald had reassured her that she had done the right thing, but she couldn't help but wonder. Was he saying that because he truly believed it, or because it was what he thought she needed to hear? The distance between them, always present, felt even more pronounced now. She could sense the difference, the subtle shift in how they related to one another, as though the weight of the world had subtly seeped between them. The time that followed was one of reflection, a quiet period where Melania withdrew further from the public eye. The pace of her life slowed, and she spent more time at home, processing the emotions and questions that had surfaced since the mall incident. She revisited the events in her mind constantly, trying to make sense of everything. What had she really learned from the experience? As she sat by the window one evening, watching the world go by, she thought about the broader implications of the events. The incident had sparked a conversation about morality, about what it means to do the right thing in a world that often rewards spectacle over substance. Her actions had been driven by an instinct to protect, but what about the man? What was his story, his truth? Was he a villain or a victim? In many ways, the story had become more about perception than reality. It had become about power. The power to shape a narrative, to control how a story unfolds, to decide who is seen as a hero and who is cast as the villain. She thought about the power that society placed on public image, the constant demand for answers, for clarity, for meaning. Was it enough to do the right thing, or did the world need more? As the days turned into weeks, Melania found herself coming to a realization. The truth of the situation was elusive, shaped by the stories people told themselves. But her actions had been real, her choice had been authentic. In a world that often seemed to value spectacle over sincerity, she had acted from a place of genuine care. That, at least, she could hold on to. The experience had changed her, though she wasn't sure if she could yet articulate how. It had taught her the complexity of human nature, the fragility of truth, and the way that even the smallest moments could shift the course of everything. In the end, it wasn't about whether she had been right or wrong. It was about the choices we make in the face of uncertainty and fear, and how those choices define us. And so, as she closed her eyes that night, Melania reflected on the journey she had been on. It wasn't just about saving a child. It was about the deeper lessons we all learn when we are forced to confront the complexities of the world and of ourselves. If you found this story moving, please like, share, and subscribe to keep up with more emotional, thought-provoking content. Thank you for watching.